We are delighted to welcome today Gregory Smith, who comes to us from the Pew Institute. Gregory is Associate Director of Research at the Pew Research Center. He helps coordinate the center's domestic polling on religion. He also writes reports and provides information to news media and others about religion and public opinion, religion and American politics, and the political views of Catholics. He holds a doctorate in government from the University of Virginia, where he is a fellow at the Center on Religion and Democracy. He is an author of the 2007 and 2014 U.S. Religious Landscape Studies, Knowledge Survey, and the Pew Research Center surveys of Muslim Americans and 2012 study on Mormons in America. He's the author of many books. And Greg, we're so happy you're here, and we welcome you. Thank you so much. Please welcome Greg.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. One correction, I'm the author of one book, not many books, maybe somewhere down the road. In any case, I'm very grateful and happy for the chance to be with all of you this morning and to provide this briefing about trends and attitudes about homosexuality in the United States and also all around the world. I'll begin by taking a very broad look at views about homosexuality in the United States. And we will see that the U.S. public has become much more accepting of homosexuality over the last couple of decades or so. That change has been driven largely by generational replacement, by the coming of age of a new generation of young people who are simply far more accepting of homosexuality than are their elders. But growing acceptance of homosexuality also reflects that many Americans have changed their minds about these issues. Now, after tackling that kind of 30,000-foot view, I'll zoom in and review the attitudes and the opinions of people from various religious traditions in the United States. How do the views of mainline Protestants compare with those of evangelicals and Catholics and Jews and people who say they have no religion? We will see that some religious groups in the United States are quite accepting of homosexuality. Others hold much more traditional views. But virtually all religious groups are moving in the same direction on these questions, and that's towards greater acceptance. Next, I'll zoom in even more with a look specifically at the attitudes of United Methodists. And we'll see that United Methodists in the United States mostly say that homosexuality should be accepted by society, but they're not necessarily convinced that same-sex couples should be able to get legally married. Finally, to conclude, I'd like to zoom all the way back out and take a look at how attitudes about homosexuality in the United States compare with attitudes around the rest of the world. Unfortunately, I don't have good data on United Methodists around the world, but what we'll see is that the United States is much less accepting of homosexuality than some places, especially in Europe, but also parts of Latin America. But the United States is much more accepting of homosexuality than are many places in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. But before I get into the data and to the trends and attitudes about homosexuality, I do want to say just a few words about the Pew Research Center, about who we are and what we do. We are an independent, nonpartisan fact tank. We call ourselves a fact tank to try to distinguish ourselves from that other kind of organization that's so common in Washington, the think tank. We do a lot of different kinds of research, including demographic analysis. We do monitoring of religious restrictions all around the world. We do international surveys about religion and about other topics. And I personally specialize in polling and survey research about religion in the United States. We adhere to a very strict non-advocacy stance, meaning that we do not endorse candidates for public office, and we also do not take positions on any political or religious issues. That sometimes comes as a surprise to people who think that the pew in our name refers to a church pew, but it doesn't. Pew is a family name, the name of the family that established the Pew Charitable Trust and the Pew Research Center. We're a nonprofit organization. We don't do any commercial or market research. It's not possible to commission the Pew Research Center to do a poll. And we also don't sell anything. We don't charge for access to our data or to our reports. We make all of our research publicly available online. Our goal is to try as best we can to promote a deeper understanding of the key trends and issues shaping the United States and the world. And I should wrap up by saying that our mission, our non-advocacy position in particular, sometimes puts us in something of an odd position because it means that we cannot suggest strategies to nonprofit groups or to religious organizations or to any other organization. But that said, it is our hope that our research can help to inform the very important work done by religious organizations, by the nonprofit sector, by religious and public leaders, and anyone else who might be interested. So what do the data show about American attitudes regarding homosexuality? Here, I think the number one thing to know, the first thing to point out, is that the public has grown steadily more accepting of homosexuality over the last couple of decades. This is a question that we've been asking in our national surveys for years. Which comes closer to your view? Homosexuality should be accepted by society, or homosexuality should be discouraged by society? Now, when we first asked this question in 1994, the public was basically split right down the middle. 46% said that homosexuality should be accepted by society, while 49% said that it should be discouraged. Over time, however, you can see here that the share advocating acceptance steadily grew, while the share saying that homosexuality should be discouraged by society steadily declined. And as it currently stands, those people who think homosexuality should be accepted by society outnumber those who say it should be discouraged by more than a 2-to-1 margin. Big social change over just a couple of decades. We see a very similar pattern in public opinion about the question of same-sex marriage. In 2001, just after the turn of the millennium, opponents of same-sex marriage clearly outnumbered supporters. And by 2004, when voters in 13 states actually passed constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage, there were twice as many people expressing opposition to the idea that same-sex couples should be able to marry as there were who supported it. But over time, here again, attitudes, the share of the public expressing support for same-sex marriage steadily grew, and the share of Americans expressing opposition to it steadily declined. And in our most recent polling on the issue, supporters of same-sex marriage outnumber opponents by almost 20 percentage points. So why have these changes in public opinion occurred? What's driving these trends? Here we can point to a couple of factors, beginning with generational replacement. Young adults, people who were children in the 90s and in the aughts when we first started asking these questions and have since aged into adulthood, young adults are far more accepting of homosexuality than are their elders. You can see here, for instance, that fully 3/4 of millennials say they think homosexuality should be accepted by society. And nearly 2/3 of Generation Xers say the same. Among the oldest generational cohort, by contrast, the view that homosexuality should be accepted by society, is a minority viewpoint. And we see the exact same kind of pattern when we look at attitudes about same-sex marriage. The big majority of millennials say they favor allowing same-sex couples to legally marry. And there's more support than opposition to same-sex marriage than there is among Generation Xers. Baby boomers, by contrast, are pretty ambivalent about same-sex marriage. And among those in the oldest generational cohorts, there's much more opposition to same-sex marriage than there is support for it. But generational change, generational replacement, is not the only reason that acceptance of homosexuality has risen. even while the millennial generation's coming of age has buoyed acceptance of homosexuality, we have also seen every generational cohort become more accepting over time. Among baby boomers, for instance, we saw a 9-point jump just between 2007 and 2014 in the share who said that homosexuality should be accepted by society. And we see the exact same kind of pattern when we look at attitudes towards same-sex marriage. Support for same-sex marriage is still a minority viewpoint among baby boomers, but you can see that they've become more supportive of it over time, as has every generational cohort. So generational replacement is part of what's happening, but it's not the whole story. The other part of what's happening is that people are changing their minds on these topics. But why is that? Why might people change their minds on these kinds of questions? Well, it turns out we've actually asked this exact question. Back in 2013, we did a big survey delving into attitudes about homosexuality in pretty minute detail. And we actually asked supporters of same-sex marriage whether or not they'd always held that point of view or if they had changed their mind and become more supportive of it. And if they'd said yes, they'd changed their mind, we asked them why. Why did you change your mind? Why have you become more supportive of same-sex marriage over time? And the number one answer we got is knowing someone who is gay. About a third of those who changed their mind to become more accepting, more supportive of same-sex marriage, said they did so because they know someone who is gay. One respondent, for example, told us, "My best friend from high school is a gay man, and he deserves the same rights." Other reasons that people give for becoming more supportive of same-sex marriage include having thought about the issue more, having given it more thought. Some people said that they'd grown more accepting because they thought it was inevitable anyway. This was something that was going to happen regardless of their own thoughts or feelings about it. Some people reference freedom in the sense that people should be free to choose how to live their own lives. And other respondents cite a belief in equal rights, with some expressing a reluctance to judge other people. So that's the big picture. That's the 30,000-foot view of attitudes about homosexuality in the United States. We've seen growing acceptance over the last couple of decades, driven partly by generational replacement, but also partly by the fact that people have changed their minds on these questions. What are the religious patterns in attitudes about these issues? Here we can see that there are very big differences, big cleavages, if you will, in the way that people from various religious backgrounds approach these questions. In some groups, big majorities say they think homosexuality should be accepted by society. More than 8 in 10 religiously unaffiliated adults, for example, say they think homosexuality should be accepted by society. And I should say just a few words about them. I'm sure you're aware that the religiously unaffiliated share of the population has been growing very rapidly in recent years. These folks, self-described atheists, agnostics, and the biggest group, people who say that their religion is just nothing in particular, this group now makes up almost a quarter of the U.S. adult population. They are sometimes called the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, not the other kind of religious nun. And they are one of the most consistently socially and politically liberal constituencies in the population, including on these questions about homosexuality. This is a big and growing and important group on the U.S. religious scene, and so I wanted to just take a moment to call them out and point that out. I also want to mention now that we've got a ton of data on broader religious trends underway in the United States, and I'd be happy to get into that during our question and answer segment if that would be of interest. You can also see here that about 7 in 10 Catholics say they think homosexuality should be accepted by society, as do 2/3 of mainline Protestants. So there are many religious groups in which we see a fairly broad consensus that homosexuality should be accepted by society. That said, this isn't the case for every group. You can see here among evangelical Protestants, for instance, most people say homosexuality should be discouraged by society. Evangelicals continue to make up the single largest religious tradition in the United States, at least in the way that we define and analyze and categorize that group. Most Mormons also say that they think homosexuality should be discouraged. We see very much the same pattern when we look at attitudes about same-sex marriage. 3/4 or so of religiously unaffiliated adults and Jews say that they favor allowing same-sex couples to marry legally, as do smaller majorities of mainline Protestants and Catholics. Those in the historically black Protestant tradition are more conflicted, with 40% expressing support for same-sex marriage and 52% opposition to it. And then down at the bottom, you can see here again that big majorities of evangelical Protestants and of Mormons express opposition to same-sex marriage. So there are very big differences of opinion between people from various religious backgrounds in their attitudes about homosexuality. Before I move on, though, I want to make one very important point. And that's this. Even though people from very different religious backgrounds express dramatically different opinions about homosexuality, the opinions of pretty much all groups are moving in the same direction, toward greater acceptance. You can see here, for instance, that though evangelicals are less supportive, less accepting of homosexuality than other groups, they've grown 10 points more likely to say that homosexuality should be accepted by society just over the last 7 years or so, or between 2007 and 2014. Same thing with Mormons. They're less accepting of homosexuality than most other groups, but they're more accepting than they were just a few short years ago. And the same pattern is evident at the other end of the spectrum. The groups that have long been accepting of homosexuality have grown even more accepting as time has gone by. Now, I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago our religious landscape study, and a lot of the data that we've seen so far come from that study. The landscape studies are unique in that they are very large. We've done 2 of them, the first in 2007 and then most recently in 2014. And in both of those studies, we interviewed nationally representative samples of more than 35,000 U.S. adults. And having such a large number of interviews is important for a couple of reasons. First, it makes it possible to analyze the religious composition of the United States and the way that it's changing with a great deal of precision. But second, and just as importantly, having a very large sample makes it possible to describe the beliefs and attitudes and opinions and characteristics of the smaller religious groups in the population. That is to say, if you interview 35,000 people, you're guaranteeing that you're going to get about 350 interviews or so with religious groups that make up as little as 1% of the U.S. population. Important groups like Missouri Synod Lutherans and Episcopalians and Jehovah's Witnesses. Having those 350 interviews allows one as an analyst to actually describe the religious beliefs and practices and views of those important groups. And that's a very unusual opportunity. Typically, national surveys only interview 1,000 or 2,000, maybe 3,000 people. And so they might include only 10 or 20 or 30 interviews with Episcopalians or other groups of that size, which just is not enough. It's not enough data to be able to say anything with any confidence about the characteristics of those groups. Well, that's a long wind-up, but the point I want to get to is that in our 2014 religious landscape study, we found that self-identified United Methodists account for a little less than 4% of the overall U.S. adult population. And our sample included interviews with more than 1,600 self-identified United Methodist respondents. So we've got some really good data on what United Methodists think about these topics and how the patterns of opinion within the United Methodist Church resemble those that we see in the public as a whole. I think the first thing to point out when looking at United Methodist views on these issues is that most United Methodists, about 6 in 10, say that they think homosexuality should be accepted by society. That's very much in line with what we see among the public as a whole, and perhaps a little bit less acceptance than we see among mainline Protestants overall. United Methodists are rather more ambivalent in their attitudes about same-sex marriage. On this question, we find that about half of United Methodists in the United States say they favor allowing gay and lesbian couples to get legally married, while 43% say they oppose same-sex marriage. Now, unfortunately, the first time we did the landscape study in 2007, the survey did not include a question about same-sex marriage. So we can't say how the views of United Methodists have changed on this particular question. We can see, however, that on the question of whether homosexuality should be accepted or discouraged by society, the views of United Methodists, just like the views of so many other groups, have become significantly more accepting. In fact, the share of United Methodists who say homosexuality should be accepted by society grew by 9 percentage points in just the 7 years between these two studies. We also see that some of the generational patterns evident in the overall data are also present among the United Methodist community. Half or more of United Methodists in every generational cohort say that homosexuality should be accepted by society. But this view is especially common among the youngest United Methodist adults. On the question of same-sex marriage, the balance of opinion among United Methodists from the silent and greatest generation actually leans against same-sex marriage. United Methodist baby boomers are split right down the middle, and most United Methodists from Generation X and the millennial cohort say that they support the idea that same-sex couples should be able to get legally married. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out one additional correlate of attitudes about homosexuality, and that is religiosity. We've known for a long time that almost regardless of denominational affiliation, people who are religiously observant tend to be more traditional in their attitudes about homosexuality as compared with people who are less religiously observant. And if you think about it, that pattern underlies some of the data that we've already seen. We saw, for example, that religious nuns who tend not to be religiously observant express some of the highest levels of acceptance of homosexuality. And at the other end of the spectrum, evangelicals and Mormons, two groups who on average exhibit some of the highest levels of religious observance, they're among the least accepting of homosexuality. We see this very same pattern among United Methodists. United Methodists who exhibit low levels of religiosity, those who rarely attend religious services, don't pray very often, they may not believe in God, or if they do believe in God, they're not certain about it, they have doubts about it, and people who say that religion is not particularly important in their lives. Among United Methodists with low levels of religiosity, fully 3/4 say they think homosexuality should be accepted by society, as do 70% of those with medium levels of religious observance. By contrast, among the most religiously observant United Methodists, those who attend services regularly and pray every day, there's far less acceptance of homosexuality, with 54% saying that it should be accepted by society. The differences are, if anything, even more pronounced when it comes to views of same-sex marriage. United Methodists with low and medium levels of religious observance mostly say they think gay and lesbian couples should be allowed to get legally married. By contrast, among United Methodists who exhibit high levels of religiosity, the balance of opinion leans in the other direction, with a bit more opposition to same-sex marriage than support for it. I know we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm getting towards the end. I'm looking forward to our discussion. We started out with a kind of 30,000-foot view of the overall landscape of American public opinion about homosexuality. We focused in a little more narrowly then on big religious traditions, and then zoomed in more narrowly still and took a look at United Methodists. To conclude, I want to zoom all the way back out and finish up by considering how public opinion about homosexuality in the United States compares with public opinion on these issues in the rest of the world. Now, as I mentioned, I don't have good data on United Methodists around the world. Most of our international surveys are just too small to be able to look at specific denominations. But that said, I do hope that just looking at the overall patterns will provide some insight, be informative. And I think the first thing to point out is that the U.S. is much less accepting of homosexuality as compared with many places in Europe. You can see here, for example, that something like 9 in 10 Spaniards and Germans say that they think homosexuality should be accepted by society, as do something like 8 in 10 Canadians and people from the Czech Republic and Australia. The United States looks very much like Mexico and Brazil in the way its people answer these questions. And you can also see here on the right side of the screen that there are lots of places around the world, especially in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, that are far less accepting of homosexuality than is the United States. I think these countries down here are some of the most interesting in places like Turkey, Malaysia, Kenya, Uganda, Indonesia, Senegal, Tunisia. Less than 10% say they think homosexuality should be accepted by society. And the last point I want to make is that around the world, just as in the United States, there is a real connection between religious observance, between religiosity, and views of homosexuality. The most religiously observant societies around the world tend to be the least accepting of homosexuality. This dot right down here is Indonesia. In Indonesia, on the whole, there's a very high level of religious observance on this scale, and very low levels of acceptance of homosexuality, just like we saw on the previous slide. Up here, this dot is France, right on the line. In France, there's a pretty low level of religious observance and a correspondingly very high level of acceptance of homosexuality. There are exceptions to this pattern. Russia is a place where there's not much acceptance of homosexuality, even though the population is not particularly religious. And in the Philippines, there's a relatively high degree of acceptance of homosexuality, even though the population is quite religious, at least compared with other societies. In any case, I think this helps make the point that there is this very tight connection between religiosity and views of homosexuality, not just in the United States, but actually all around the world. I'm going to stop with that. We've seen that the U.S. public has grown more accepting of homosexuality in recent decades, and that change has been driven partly by generational replacement, but also partly by people changing their minds on these questions. United Methodists in the United States mostly say that homosexuality should be accepted by society, but they're more ambivalent when it comes to same-sex marriage. And many of the patterns that we see among the general public, the generational patterns, the increasing acceptance of homosexuality, the link between religiosity and views on these issues, all those patterns are evident among United Methodists, just as they are among the public as a whole. Finally, we've put the U.S. in a broad global context and seen that the United States is less accepting than some places around the world, but significantly more accepting of homosexuality than many countries in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. I hope that this information has been informative. I'm looking forward to discussion. I'm going to do my best to respond to any questions or comments that you might have. And I should also say that we have a ton of data on all kinds of things, on trends in the religious composition of the United States and the links between religion and politics, and I'd be happy to do my best to try to speak about any of those if that would be of interest.